we have David Jonker, Senior Director of Big Data Initiatives, SAP, Aaron McLaughlin, Managing Partner of Big Insights, and Greta Kudelenko, Co-Founder, CEO, Assertive Systems Analytics, and Kevin Tour, Managing Director, Open Data Exchange. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to welcome tonight's sponsor and say a few words. So if you would, David Jonker, SAP.
Fantastic to have everyone out today to see the film. SAP's been rolling out the film worldwide. We've done 50 screenings so far, and been involved in sort of rolling that out in other places. So it's fantastic to do it in my hometown. And we'll be doing probably another 50 next year. So it's been highly successful for us. And I'm sure as you watch the film, you'll see the power of the storytelling that's done. The film was put together by two brothers, Rick Smolin. He's actually a world-renowned photojournalist, and he's worked for Time, Life, National Geographic. He sold millions of books, and so he took on this project, The Human Face of Big Data. It started as a book, really kind of a crowdsourcing project. So he engaged photographers and photojournalists from around the world to go and collect stories about big data, and then bring them back and turn it into a book. And then he teamed with his brother, Sandy Smolin. His brother just happens to be an award-winning Hollywood director. He's directed many shows that you would probably recognize, shows on NBC, ABC, HBO, so on and so forth. And it shows in the film. It's played the film festival circuit. It's won a number of awards for cinematography, and it really sort of tells a story about big data. SAP went and sponsored the film a number of years ago. Rick approached me and said, "Look, we're looking for sponsors to sort of underwrite this film." And at the time, SAP was trying to figure out how to up-level the big data story. A lot of the conversation with our customers was around Hadoop. Hadoop and how do I store data, all that kind of stuff. But SAP is a big enterprise application vendor. In fact, we're the largest enterprise application vendor in the space. We touch 70% of every business transaction that happens at some point touches an SAP system. So we have a huge footprint in the largest companies in the world. And the CEOs were coming and saying, well, I read this article in this newspaper, it talked about big data. We should be doing something like that. Or they'd say, Google has figured out how to use big data. I want to be the Google of my industry. And so we were trying to figure out how do you bridge that gap. On the one side, you've got IT that wanted to talk about Hadoop and figure out how to just kind of collect some data. And on the other side, you have the CEO who was saying, this could transform my business. What does that look like? And so the film, it was kind of quite honestly, it was a bit of a crapshoot. We were like, well, we're not really sure what's going to be coming out of it, but it seems like a great concept. We've used the film to engage in conversation, the kind of conversation that we'll have tonight. What is big data? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for business? What does it mean for me personally? What does it mean for society? What are the risks? All those sorts of things. The promise and the peril is the way they phrase it in the film. And so hopefully we'll have a great conversation tonight, and the conversations continue after the panel. And at SAP, of course, we'd love to have a conversation with you. So whether you're a company, looking to engage in big data, whether you're a potential partner that has big data solutions that we could bring to our customers, or whether you're a developer out there actually looking for a big data job. We are, in fact, hiring one or two. So we'd love to have conversations with you at SAP, and hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
All right, that was a great documentary. Did everyone learn something today? Yes, can I get a round of applause if you learned something today? A lot of information was covered, and I'm really happy to help host a panel today, a panel of experts around big data, all from diverse backgrounds. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Emil McLean. I assist with the Internet of Things Waterloo group. Thank you for coming out tonight. And we're going to spend, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Heck, if the conversation goes well, let's take an all-nighter, right? And talk about big data tonight and implications and how it ties in with Internet of Things. So to kick things off, what I'll do is I'll allow the panelists to introduce themselves. Yeah?
Great. Thank you, first of all, for bringing this to the region. This was fantastic. I've been wanting to see this for a while, so it's great that we could do it in this forum. So I've been in technology for 20 years now, which makes me sound incredibly old, 15 of which have been spent in the data realm. So a lot of it at the beginning was focused on data analytics, visualization, data sourcing, cleansing, all the things you need to make those nice graphs on those nice reports. Very quickly moved over into a more strategic role in which I was looking at data management across the whole. About 5 years ago, my team was challenged with pulling together data from all kinds of disparate data sources, monitoring data, log data, production database data, bring that all together and in support of a network operations center, a global operations center. We were talking about millions of rows of data, billions of rows in some cases, and it became very apparent that we didn't have the technology or the tools we needed. So that began my forte into the big data space. I hold many posts right now. So I am the Director of Business Analytics at Sun Life. I see a couple of people in the crowd here from my team. I'm also co-founder with Kevin of the Big Data Peer-to-Peer group in Waterloo. And there's a couple of other folks as well. We have an event on Tuesday, if I may take a moment, where we'll be talking about Spark and some of the technologies in the big data space. I'm also have been asked to develop a series for the Women in Computer Science Club at the University of Waterloo, so I'm really looking forward to that in the new year. And I am incredibly excited and energized about my role as managing partner for a local big data startup called Big Insights. Big Insights is focused on the strategy, platform, deployment, implementation for big data ecosystems and really helping companies get past that high barrier of entry that exists as they're trying to start getting into this space. So great team of people. I'm really excited about it. Thank you.
Kevin Tour. I run the Strategic Initiatives Group at Communitech. And also one of the projects that's come out of my group is the Open Data Exchange, which was launched in May of this year. The purpose of the Open Data Exchange is to help the private sector tap into vast amount of open data that's predominantly at this point being created by governments around the world. And it's turning into an extremely big and vast and rich resource. But the whole essence of open data has been around creating transparency in open government, and our focus with the Open Data Exchange is to say, let's take advantage of all this data that's being made available, and let's help the private sector tap into that, and let's look at open data as being an enabler for solving problems. And I think we're going to get into this as we go along, and it's part of the challenge I think we face with whether it be open data, IoT, big data, is they seem to be taking on lives of their own, and I don't think that's really what this is all about. I think it's about, these things are enablers, and so part of what we're doing with Open Data Exchange is treating open data as an enabler and figuring out how we can put that to use to solve real-world problems. Also, as part of what we do, or my group is focusing on at Communitech, as part of a bigger data strategy is looking at how do we build an ecosystem, a stronger, more vibrant ecosystem that enables the creation of more and more applications that are data enabled. And that's still very much at the early stage. But again, it's a focus on looking at these techniques, these things as enablers, and I got a little nauseous from sitting in the front row. I think Aaron said so too. I know why I come to a movie theater early, because sitting in the front row doesn't do it for me. But the amount, I mean, sort of the content that came out of that film was, there's so many things to think about. And I think if we we can either be pessimistic and scared of it, or we can take it and look at it as an opportunity. And so that's a big part of what we want to do with Communitech, is to look at how we can turn this into opportunity, but also take into consideration, the precautions so that we can turn this into big value.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Greta Kutelenko. So I'm part of a research group at the University of Waterloo, where we started developing algorithms for analyzing machine data, so data coming out of various types of equipment on manufacturing floors, vehicles, aircraft, all sorts of data coming out of such systems. And one area we focus on is using this data to gain insight into the machines, so try to understand how they're behaving through looking at the data, understand when they're starting to break down, understand how we can use this data for predictive maintenance. And that's how Acerta was started. So I'm the founder of Acerta, and what we do is we use all of this data to automatically detect anomalies in the system, and then use this information to predict potential problems in the machines before they happen. So say you have your vehicle, and as it's becoming more connected, as it's becoming more autonomous, how can we use the data these machines generate to basically service them better, to make maintenance more effective, to find defects early so that things such as with Volkswagen don't happen again. So these are some of the things we're working on.
Hello, my name is David Jonker. I'm with SAP. I'm a senior director of big data initiatives there. I'm local to Waterloo. Went to university here in the what was the Sybase office. Started working at Sybase. Spent many years on the database side of the house, and then big databases. When Sybase was acquired by SAP, I moved over and helped launch SAP's big data strategy. And now I'm focused on a number of big data initiatives. Some of them, for example, is how to drive conversation with our customers, like the film and programs like that, and finding use cases that are relevant to our customers at SAP. Some of it is figuring out how to leverage data to solve interesting problems. So I do some work with global partnership around the UN, how to take big data and address some of the biggest global challenges that we face in the world. And then other initiatives, for example, local initiatives that we've got around how to address, for example, fraud in the food industry, and how do you apply big data to solve that problem. We won't talk about some of the things that you might eat or you think you're eating, but in fact, actually you're eating something different. But anyway, so.
Thank you very much. You're welcome, everyone. One housekeeping thing. One thing that I communicated to the panelists before we started, or before we arrived to this event, is that let's treat this as a casual conversation amongst friends, just about 250 of us. So if you have questions, unfortunately we don't have someone to walk around with a microphone, but stand up, put your hand up, and you don't have to wait until the end. If there's something that's burning right now in your mind, let's talk about it and we'll take questions. You'll just have to shout a bit loud for everyone to hear. But let's get into it. So a lot of things were covered in this documentary today, and one thing that I just want to start off with as someone who's not an expert in big data is, in one sentence, 2 sentences, what is it? We just saw a documentary that talked about different scenarios. We see examples of its use, but in 1 or 2 sentences, what does big data actually boil down to? David?
Okay, great question. So the purists, the technologist purists in the audience would probably say, well, it's all about large amounts of data that get stored and analyzed. And there's probably some threshold in your mind. So it's either 100 terabytes, petabyte, maybe 10 terabytes if your environment's really sort of struggling, if you like. But from the world I sit in, working with some of the largest companies in the world, they view it as an opportunity, and they don't get too particular about whether it's a vast amount of data or whether it's about predictive algorithms or it's the fact that there's this data, and whatever the quantity, I can take that and turn it into value in some way.
For me, it's a vast amount of information, of untapped often information about the world around you. It's information that we typically see, we kind of perceive, but we never really collected before, we never really did anything with it before. So it's just a really large amount of information that we want to make use of, but might not yet know how to?
I have no idea. And quite frankly, I don't care. And part of the reason why I don't care, it goes back to that I think we get so hung up on what it is and what it isn't, we forget what it can do for us. And we give it, I mentioned it earlier on, we give it a life of its own, and it doesn't deserve a life of its own. It's an enabler, it's a thing. In the end, big data, IoT, all this ultimately is about the person, it's about the individual. And at best, I think big data just describes a pool of techniques and enablers that we can bring to the party to create value for human beings.
Well, I don't even know if I have to say anything after that.
That's all right.
But I'll just add that I've noticed it's becoming it's excitement. Big data is synonymous with excitement and opportunity. And I can walk into a group of data analysts or data folks and say we're going to do big data, and they just light right up. They don't care what it means. They don't know what it means. It's a mind shift. It's a different way of looking at doing things better.
And what isn't big data? Like, what's the difference between big data and market research, or just research in general? Is there some type of leap that isn't being covered in what we consider today traditional research?
I think a key to big data and how it's being used as a term now is it's looking at things differently. So it's looking at data where you wouldn't have thought data existed before. So, I mean, from a component level, you're looking at monitoring logs and coupling that with application level logs and finding out what's happening when there's a soccer game on to message traffic. You're doing all these different things. That's what big data is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's actually a great way of capturing it. It's a site. There's been research going on forever, but typically in research you say I'm looking for this kind of data, and then you go and collect it. Whereas with big data, it's this idea that everything's spewing off data now, and I'm going to collect that, and this is more idealistic versus what actually happens with customers today. But the idea is I'm just going to go collect this data, and then I'll figure out what to do with it later, right? And there might be sort of tangential stories or tangential applications to what it was originally meant to capture. Like the Google Trends search, right? It wasn't really meant to capture flu trends, but it's a sort of a tangential application of the data.
And I think the whole space allows that to happen. Whereas in the more traditional environment, it's, no, I was looking for that. I didn't find that. Let's go start again, and I'll try and find something else. Whereas it's a fluid organism.
Okay, thank you. And when it comes to, once we gather all this data, how do we know what to do with it? Do we have to have a question? Do we have to know what we're looking for? Or is it just, we have this pile of data and all of a sudden answers bubble up? And what is that process? Greta, I'll kind of put you on the spot with a company that thrives on taking data, finding trends, and then coming up with predictive analytics. How does that actually work?
Well, a lot of the times we start with a question of what it is that we want to predict, what it is that we want to see from this data. Oftentimes, you start by having a few key players who have started with the collection first. So they started by collecting all of this data, putting all of the sensors, putting all of the technology in place to get all of this data, and then they're faced with the problem, what do I do with it? And they kind of start defining some of the actionable steps that we can take and what we can do from this data. And then once they define that, often we start to have some of these more applications in mind, and more collection can follow, other people can follow with the collection and getting more data in place and stored and analyzed for those kind of applications.
At SAP, we see successful companies, and we see some unsuccessful companies as they're trying to figure out data. And from our point of view, you have a higher level of success if you, or a lower level of success. If you start with, the IT guys have collected some data, great, and then some IT folks, do some analysis and they find some, correlation, let's say. and then they try and sort of push that up to the business. That's very difficult. You're kind of pushing uphill with that sort of approach, right? Because you might, so for example, you might find some interesting correlation, but frankly, the business guys could care less because it's going to save them, $10 versus $1 million. Or maybe it'll save some money, but the problem is there's no way to build it into your business processes to make use of it. Whereas the successful companies say, look, big data is relevant to us, and so we're going to start collecting this data, but we're also going to start defining or aligning some big data projects with sort of our business imperative. What are the biggest problems that we're facing in the business? And start there. And then the thing that we often recommend is figure out how you're going to apply those insights in your business processes, right? Because like Google search is a perfect example of that. They go and index the web, but if they hadn't figured out how to operationalize that in terms of an instant response, and something that you do on a daily basis and how you would tie ads to it, it'd be pretty useless information. And so if you haven't thought through how you're going to apply it in your day-to-day operations, it's very difficult to sort of tap that value.
I think I'd just add that a lot of the successful companies that I've seen, that we've seen at Big Insights that have done the proper implementations have actually driven from the marketing and sales department. And I don't think there's any, I don't think that's really a surprise when you think that they're the revenue generators, right? So they have the problems that they're trying to solve, and they know that they have to look outside of the traditional data that sits inside their company. And so it's...
Yeah, there's talk of the chief marketing officer being a bigger IT spender than the CIO in some companies anyway.
Yeah.
Increasing trend.
Yeah, and they directly impact the infrastructure that gets put in place.
And I actually have a very good example of something similar. So GE, when they release, say, some of their wind turbines, they have an idea of remote monitoring. So they sell you their turbines and they collect the data for you. They monitor the equipment for you. They can tell you when something's going wrong. They can call you, say, hey, I've noticed something's happening. How can I help you? And they earn millions of dollars from just offering that kind of service, something that a smaller other equipment manufacturer is not doing. They're just selling you their equipment, and they can't get the same kind of market benefit, the same kind of financial benefit out of their product as, say, GE can by just finding a way to use the big data in this case for their benefit and the customer's benefit.
And I think it's empowering a whole new economy. It's called the sharing economy. And I think one of the early entrants into that was, I believe it was Rolls-Royce, and it was sort of power by the hour on their jet engines. So instead of paying the capital cost for buying a jet engine, what the new model became was they collected the data on this engine, they knew how it operated, they knew when it was operating, they knew when it needed maintenance, and they actually charged the customer by the hour that it was being used. So that changes the dynamic significantly, and that's the kind of thing that power, or that big data can empower. But it starts with a problem, it starts with a business need, and I think that's the key of it, because otherwise it can quickly become overwhelming.
Thank you. So actually transitioning over to open data. So Kevin, not to put you on the spot, but with the great announcement about the open data program that is now going to be funded moving forward, this is a model, correct me if I'm wrong, where we're now able to take, the government will share data, which will be shared in an open form where we all can benefit from it. Can you talk about what the vision is behind that and how we can take, let's say, open source data basically and crunch it down in a way that can benefit us individually or by organization or society in general?
Absolutely. So for those of you that aren't aware, I did mention it briefly. Open Data Exchanges is a public-private initiative that came together as a result of 5 partners coming to the table to enable that, and that was D2L, OpenText, University Waterloo, Communitech, and the Canadian Digital Media Network. And then the federal government came to the table with some matching funding and allowed us to start. And the whole premise is, it's as you mentioned, it's how do we allow the private sector to tap into these open data sources for creating value-added applications. The whole revolution of open data came from transparency, open government, so you can imagine that You know, putting something up on a website in PDF format isn't exactly empowering when it comes to trying to access that data and use it for commercial good. And so we're trying to change the culture and trying to change the thinking of, how can we use this data, because it's extremely rich data and there's lots of it out there. And it's not just a regional phenomenon, it's not just a national phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. So you can imagine whoever is able to crack that nut first is going to be the one that's going to be able to take a global leadership position on this. And so it's really, again, it's the same theme over and over again, as though let's not look at open data as being this wonderful data push, and choke on it. Let's actually think about, okay, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, and these are sources I can pull from. That will drive standards, that will drive policy, that will drive value, and that will drive the entire supply chain, and it'll help even the suppliers of the data figure out which data sets they should be making available.
And can you give examples of what kind of information is actually available or will be available through the Open Data Exchange?
So just as sort of as a point of reference, the federal government itself, they make over 200,000 data sets available. And so that doesn't count all the municipalities, all the cities, all the provinces, all the countries, and everything else. So in aggregate, there's well over millions of data sets that are available out there. And you can only imagine what that is. It's everything from weather data to geospatial data to the idea of median incomes across the country to, and of course the topic of late is the return of the long-term census, because with the disappearance of that allowed, or that took away the opportunity for people to, sort of trends and things to be identified. So that's all come back. And now, so with that, it creates all these kinds of opportunity, and but the challenge is that it's in different formats. There's very few cases of where it is already standardized, and mapping data is one of them. Temperature data is another one. Financial reporting data in XBRO format is another one. But those are very few. And so we don't host the data. We point people to the data sets that are available. 9 times out of 10, the supply chain will be broken, because again, this is all being done for different reasons. So we want to influence the conversation so that we can actually help that creation of that supply chain, bring partners to it, and help create those applications.
Great. Oh, we have a question?
I'm really excited and interested about both the idea of open data and also about the idea of exchange. But it seems like there's very little open data or exchange. It seems like it's going in one direction from government to the private sector, but there was very little discussion either in the documentary or now in your panel about information going from corporations to the private citizen, or even from the public to the private person. So there's not really an exchange in that sense. And then also open data seems to be not very applicable, because corporations seem to use data and store it away and lock it, and actually don't allow us access to it. So I'm really curious what you have to say as, maybe being involved in corporations that deal with data, on how we should deal with giving data for free to the public and to the citizens to allow for citizen engagement with data.
Very much at the early stages of all this, and sometimes it is a bit of a misnomer. Open data isn't sometimes all that open, but I would say that there is a push towards. There are more and more municipalities, countries, etc., adopting an open by default policy, meaning that they have to make the case for not opening it as opposed to closing it off. So the trend is in the right direction, but you're absolutely correct. It's just because it's being made available doesn't mean it is available. And from the private sector perspective, and I guess by definition, I think it's often assumed that open data is government data. And again, I think for the most case, that is actually true as it stands right now. But what we're finding in talking with some of the larger corporations and those that are sitting on vast amounts of data is they're starting to ask the question, gee, I wonder what would happen core sample data to the public. And they put the challenge on it saying, if you can help us figure out where we should be digging to find gold, we've got $500,000 worth of prize money here for you to do that. And they opened it up as a challenge. And again, these peers in the industry thought he was crazy. The long and short of it, what came out of it is that the solution that they chose to act upon came from one of the more unlikely areas. So it wasn't the geologist within the company that found it, it was somebody who specialized in visualization. That $500,000 investment turned into a $6 or $7 billion strike for the company. So really what it comes down to is the value exchange. Because opening up data without any reason for opening up data is just represents pure risk for those that have the data set. And that's why if there's a value proposition to be had, then I think that we're going to see more and more of this happen. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get examples like this out there more and more so we can show, let's figure out what the value exchange is, and by doing that, then I think we're going to see more and more companies say, okay, I see how that's done, I'm going to give that a try. And I think that the momentum is heading in that direction.
Although it's got to go beyond the value exchange. One of the definitely that's a huge part of it, right? But even you get past the value exchange. So SAP is a German company, and as a German company, Germany is probably the Switzerland for data, right? I mean, it's got the strictest data privacy laws in the world, and so that affects how SAP sort of approaches data, for example. And even if we wanted to give away data, and we do open up some of our own data, there are a lot of challenges with that from a privacy perspective. So for example, the film talks about, imagine you just opened up, mobile phone data. Well, mobile phone data talks about a person specifically, right? So, how do you, yes, you can strip out the person's name, anonymize it at that level, but there's a lot of personal identifying information just based on, the GPS coordinates. Or another example would be, I think it was the Netflix project, where essentially Netflix had the contest, they put out the data, right? And they anonymized it all. It was just, based on ratings you made, of different films, they took out stripped out all the names. So you think that would be completely anonymous, but they could actually then, someone was clever enough to figure out that you could actually map that back to users on IMDb, I think it was, and actually figure out who they were. So even just the basic recommendations, identify you, right? Even if you strip out. So it's important to actually move towards open data. But there's the value exchange, but then there's also the privacy laws, and the governments have, the laws across countries are varied, conflicting in many cases, and very difficult to navigate for a company. Hence the reason they often just say it ain't happening, unless the cause is really important. Now, very quickly, one caveat to that is, one of the projects I'm working on is a global it's called the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and it was just launched earlier this year. It's based on the United Nations, or the member states of the United Nations, so 193 countries, ratified 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they are building on the Millennium Development Goals. I don't know if you guys have heard of those that were passed in the year 2000, and they're far-reaching goals. Like the Millennium Development Goals had, for example, cut in half the number of people living in extreme poverty was one of them, for example. And so they've come up with, they've more than doubled the number now. There's 17 of them. And but this time around, so think about it, year 2000, the internet was really sort of, it was there, and we were all using it, but hadn't really sort of taken off. This time around, so the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, look, if we're going to do this, let's bake in the data revolution, all this data that we've got, to figure out how to monitor and achieve them. And so coming out of that was a recommendation to form a global partnership. And this partnership brings together governments, NGOs, civil society, and the private sector. And the idea is to how do they harness private sector data, because the private sector frankly has government obviously has a ton of data, but private sector has an intense amount of data.
how do we harness that data to address some of these issues? So, for example, you know, a lot of emerging countries, you know, their statistical offices, you know, don't even exist. And you're lucky if they do a census every 5 years or 10 years, you know, you're doing really well. But private companies are collecting data on these people all the time. Mobile operators, for example, are tracking you every second. And so the idea is if you could open up that data, so open data is actually fundamental to figuring out how to address, essentially what I'm saying is open data is fundamental to figure out how to address some of the biggest global challenges we have on the planet. And if we don't figure out how to do that, we're kind of screwed. And a lot of private sector companies are recognizing that, right? But there are very real challenges to get past that, right? Like there are privacy laws that you can't break. Well, I mean, you can break, but you know there are consequences of that. And so, you know, you have these conflicts that you got to figure out.
Private sector and owning data. That's an interesting concept. Actually, there's parts. Oh, you know what? We'll stop for a question. Go ahead.
Maybe more for Kevin than anyone else. I guess we have standards bodies around the world for, you know, ISO standards for manufacturing, things like that. I think being a programmer myself, I've found that the biggest problem with data is often organizing it. You know, we can collect it in various different formats, but we're looking at open data around the world. You know, does Canada and Zimbabwe, do we collect parks data the same way? Are we collecting healthcare data the same way? Are we standardizing these things around the world, or are we going to have to say, well, you know, there's 100 and some odd countries around the world, and so they all collect it differently, and to work with that data, we need to hire people who can all sort of massage them to align with each other. Are there any initiatives, I guess, going on right now that could deal with that, or?
Well, I mean you've hit upon one of the key issues. Is this market is at such an early stage that they're still struggling with this, and sort of it reminds me back to the days, many probably won't remember this, but the beta, you know, VHS battle, right? There was a couple standards out there for your VCR, and one eventually won because they provided the most value, or there was I think it was the porn industry that actually drove it. But anyways, I didn't mention that. I don't know how I got into that, and how we got from porn to your question about open data. But anyways, getting back to that, so that's one of the bigger challenges. But there are instances where that has occurred, and again, I look at some of it's the GTFS format, I think it is, for mapping. It's the XBRL for financial reporting. These are becoming global standards. So there are instances where it's happening out there, but in each instance, and I'll speak to XBRL. I mean, that came about because the securities commissions and the banks said, "What companies? If you want to do business with us, you're going to have to report in this format. If you don't, sayonara." And so they had no choice but to follow suit. I mean, I guess that's one way to drive a standard, is with a big stick. But in the end, there's got to be a reason for doing it. And somehow they've done that, you know, because mapping data, you know, is everywhere. Weather data is everywhere. So there is hope, but I don't think there's any one standard that's going to solve all of our problems. And my premise and my philosophy is it's going to be driven by an industry. It's going to be the weather industry, it's going to be the mapping industry, it's going to be the financial industry, and then these things will fall into place. But I don't for a second think that it's a one solution fits all.
Actually, continuing with that question, Aaron and Greta, I'm going to put you guys on the spot. And do you see a day where that can happen, and what would that look like?
In terms of a data standard?
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, that's standards start for a reason. Open data has probably got the biggest fundamental master data management problem on a global scale. It's what organizations face on a regular basis. How do I make sure that I have single source of the truth? How do I make sure I have everything on the format, the same consistent format within my organization across the world? So it's definitely going to, I think it's going to take a real concerted effort from somebody who's going to make a difference with the application they're trying to build. That's the only way that's going to happen.
And I think there has to be some kind of big driving force for them to actually want to standardize it across multiple levels. Because if you think about it, there have been a lot of standards for a lot of things, and people often find a reason to not follow it. And even if most people will follow it, there'll always be someone who will decide it doesn't exactly fit my need. So I think that there needs to be some kind of value or some kind of reasoning that everyone derives from it, so they agree on it, for them to actually want to follow the same kind of standard. And a lot of the times I think I come back to logs, computer logs, network logs, so many different standards, so many different ways to store the data. And there are open source standards, there are different standards defined by companies, but still somehow someone else sneaks in a standard and thinks their standard is better, At least there will always be evolution about what you think the best way to store and represent data as to be.
Although we did see it with the Industrial Revolution, right? So eventually things did standardize, right? Trains were running on different kinds of tracks until people realized, holy crap, if we all put it on the same track, then we can, use each other's rail lines. So, we all follow the same standards for driving today, for the most part. So, so there is hope, I think.
Hopefully IoT will be that hope for standardization of data.
Before we get to your question, Catherine, did you have a question?
I guess it was, so I've been learning a little bit lately about the idea of Internet of Things and smart infrastructure, particularly through streetlights. And I've learned that the city of Kitchener is evaluating the possibility of how to use these streetlights that are being upgraded. Sorry, not streetlights, not traffic lights, it's streetlights. And how do you employ that smart technology? And so it's a little bit of an FYI for this crowd because we're all interested in this. This is going on, they're evaluating that. But it's also a question for the panel. Where do you see the opportunities in this region? Can you talk a little bit about that when it comes to infrastructure and could that be studying and tracking real-life data? We're talking about it in general, but what about this community? Are there other projects going on that you can educate the crowd on?
Well, not in terms of other projects, but that's very synonymous with the pothole example, right? You're crowdsourcing information on how to keep operational costs down for the city. You don't have to have people out there constantly checking on things, or and with the sensors everywhere, again, that constant transmission of data, you're able to do similar to what Greta's company is doing. You're able to start predicting when things are going to go out. So it just reduces the costs across everybody, which is better for taxes.
Another thing that I've seen people do is by installing sensors in lights, for example, is to look at power consumption. How can we decrease power consumption? When, for example, you can see it, when do some of these lights need to be on versus don't need to be on? How can we reduce the amount of power we're spending on these lights? That could be one useful way to utilize that.
So, Catherine, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Are those the reasons why the city's doing that? Like, why do they want to do this?
Well, there's a study across the region, all the cities, and they're looking at LED lighting for streetlights. And so they've done that with going to council in about a month or so without approval. And in the meantime, there was somebody at the city who said, wait a second, there's an opportunity here to look at IoT. So they're in the process of studying that. And so I'm just putting it out there because we've got a group of people here that are all interested in this topic. And I just wanted to stir the pot a little bit. That people thinking that, here's an opportunity, a real live one, that if you're interested in this topic, let's connect to the city of Kitchener, because they're starting to think about it. And,
Do we all need to show up at like a council meeting or something?
tell you what, I'm going to connect Neil and Group to this person, and I think that person would be interested in hearing what other ideas this community has and why not connect the dots, right?
That's cool.
And
Should
anyone
invite
else
them to an IoT meetup meeting.
Yes, and anyone who wants to respond to that or has suggestions, you know how to reach the IoT Waterloo group, so please send us your comments, and maybe even that's a discussion point where we bring someone out to discuss that at our next meetup. Thanks, Catherine. We had a question over here.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it back to the Sustainable Development Data Initiative that David is working on, which I think is great. So lots of new information from countries that didn't necessarily have information before. I assume this is global. And then Aaron was saying, and David were mentioning that the best examples were companies that kind of went all in. And they decided that big data would be useful, and so let's see what we can learn from it. But that requires a lot of resources, and that requires a lot of education. So, and then the other thing is that with the Sustainable Development Initiative, it connects people with interest but not necessarily resources. So NGOs don't necessarily get funded for exploratory work. They get funded for implementation of projects, for instance. So how do we get around that, A, and B, does this imply that the solution is through companies, and then, who have, say, a large organization who has that capacity, but then what dangers or what situations does that create?
That's a lot of questions there. So I'll challenge you in that I don't believe it is expensive to get started in this space. Amazon has made it very easy to spin up a cluster very, very quickly. Yes, you do need some people with some technical skills, but I don't think you need. This is part of the mind shift. So traditional risk-averse companies, absolutely, they need to go through a lot of trying to figure out what is this going to do to my existing IT operations. What does this mean to me? It's very uncomfortable, I think, for IT because essentially what you're doing is you're putting the data in the hands of end users, and that can be very uncomfortable as well. I think that you can get started if you have a pointed problem you're trying to solve and then build. And that's where I've seen the most success. Not when you just go in and say, I'm going to install Hadoop. Well, then what? Right? It's the people that say, here's my problem. I need something this big. Let's try it. Let's be agile. Let's iterate. And if it works, great. But if it doesn't, we haven't actually invested that much. And so that's what that's where we're seeing success, especially from the Big Insight side, and that's what we help people do is let's just try it. Let's just try it. We've talked about it for so long. It's happening. Talk is everywhere right now. Everyone's talking about it, but there's very few people that are actually just trying to action it.
Can we get some commentary around Internet of Things and big data? So, where do you see these two, subjects colliding? Where are we going to see benefit out of it? And some great examples around, where big data and IoT will provide benefits not only for private sector but also the community, Waterloo region, and beyond.
So, my latest soapbox that I started to get on in the last week or so was around the whole Smarter Cities initiative. I like a smart cities approach to it because what it implies is that if we take that kind of approach, what we're doing is we're creating solutions that's going to make a city smarter. I think the question is what is a smart city? I think we have to define those sorts of things. But an example that came up this afternoon where I think both of those could collide. It's a great example is around the whole idea, and I guess I'll ask it, who here has been affected by the construction in Waterloo region and Waterloo Kitchener? Anybody? Just a few? Okay. So imagine if you are driving an ambulance and you get a call and you need to get to a certain spot and you have to encounter that. So there's big impact with that. And I've had a couple conversations around this, and what I heard is what the fire department's doing is they're actually going out and driving around on a daily basis to figure out what's closed and what's not, and what's congested and what's not, for a way so that if they do get a call, then they know what's the best way to get there. So then I got to thinking about that. Okay, well then, these emergency vehicles already have sensors on them. They're already tracked and everything of that sort. Combine that with open data, and imagine if you set a smart cities goal where you say, okay, let's set a goal where we're going to take the average response time from 20 minutes down to 10, regardless of sort of what's in the way, be it construction or whatever. So make it real time, make it adaptive. Those are the kinds of things that turn into real value, because that could literally save a life. And those are the kinds of things where, these are cases where it's not about IoT, it's not about open data, it's not about big data, it's about how do we bring our capabilities together to solve a problem and make life better, quantity of life, quality of life better. And that's ultimately what a smart city is about, is about making it, better for its citizens. It's a living, breathing organism. And so we need to do that. So I think that's just one thing. that I think we could do. And I think if you think about it long enough and you think about the problems we face on a daily basis, then you start applying these techniques and use them as enablers to actually come up with real viable solutions.
The companies that are winning right now are the companies that are using their data. They're the ones that are treating them as an asset, not a burden. For so many years it's been, oh, I've got to grow my database again, I've got to get more storage, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And now they're realizing that there's such a gold mine in there. From an IoT perspective, from an app development perspective, make data part of your DNA. Every interaction that your customer or your user has with your software or website, whatever, get something back from them on that in a very responsible way, of course, where you're not violating any privacy rules. But it's important for you, not just from understanding who your customers are or who your user base is, but also for how they're using the different functionality. So there's the example of education software where if you actually take the time, so for example, you're presenting a video up to some students, and if you take the time to digitize that video and figure out that from this second to this second I'm talking about this topic, from this minute to this minute I'm talking about that topic, and then you start to track in your application the interaction, you're collecting the data on how many times they're reviewing back to that particular minute or that second or whatever. You can then say, oh, well, maybe we need to provide them more information on this particular topic. And all of a sudden on the side of the screen, on this blog post or wherever, a suggestion for reference material, comes the stuff that they could keep rewinding to. So it's those little things where you can do that as an application developer. You can get data back from every interaction, and you can do it anonymously.
Great, thank you. We're getting close to the end, so there are 2 more questions that I want to ask, and we have a few more questions out in the crowd. We'll start with you.
Just a quick one. When the internet came along, you created a boom of different companies that sort of resulted out of that. And with this being, relatively new type of thing, do you foresee that there'll be an explosion of a new kind of ecosystem and types of companies? And if you do, what are some of the characteristic types of companies that you might expect to emerge out of this new technology?
Well, for me, I've been seeing a lot of companies emerging in an analysis kind of side, and how do we use a lot of this data. So a lot of analytics using AI, using deep learning, using all sorts of type of analysis. So many companies around that area. A lot are for business intelligence, a lot are finding or creating just very generic kind of analysis tools. So many companies in that. Another one is sensor. A lot of companies are emerging with sensors, so many companies, and creating all sorts of sensors, smart home sensors, general sensors for vehicles, for turbines, all sorts of industrial kind of applications. So those are the 2 that I'd say I've been noticing a lot.
Yeah, so from an SAP perspective, we're actually looking for companies that are figuring out how to address, combine, the sensors and the data and the algorithms that address specific problems, that our customers face. And I think that there'll be a huge ecosystem around that, right? Because, to solve some of these problems, you need to have the industry or, the domain expertise is fundamental to figuring all these sorts of things out, right? Everything from the sensors, so on and so forth. And, there's a huge opportunity for smaller companies to say, look, I've solved this problem. You're not going to solve it. Big company, SAP or whoever, I'll solve it for you. And you just have to figure out how to integrate it into your business processes. So.
We had a couple other questions in the back there. We'll start way at the back. Thank you.
So my organization is building a shopper marketing application, something to the effect of what you were talking about, that having that target in the phone. And we're integrating sensor technology into it. We're looking at 600,000 sensors, collecting a lot of data of how the consumers are behaving inside the store and how they're reacting to certain stimulus and that kind of thing. My big question right now, because this is for a client of mine, and my big question right now is, I sort of talk to them about analytics, like who are you using, or what's happening, what when does an analytics kind of firm kind of come into the picture, and how do you best work with or engage with that in that kind of relationship?
Probably lots of answers on that one. Go ahead.
Well, in terms of when to engage them, I mean, right from the beginning, even if it's just from a consulting perspective, without having any hands-on keyboard, just what are the things that you should be looking at? What is the data you should be collecting? How is the best way to collect that? Even just to have some conversations, whether they're ready to actually start executing on that or not. It may drive decisions that are being made in the product, and it's important to get ahead of those.
Yeah, there's a perfect time, of course, would be at the beginning. Sometimes you might not be comfortable with that, right? Right at the end is probably the worst time. It's sort of finding that balance. I would say probably different big data applications will require different big data architectures, right, or IT architectures, depending on what you're trying to do. And I'd say at a minimum, if you've aligned with the business and you figured some of those things out, maybe you've done some of the basic research to figure out, what the algorithms can do, all that kind of stuff. Great. When you get to the next stage, which says, okay, now how am I going to apply this, in the store operationally, right, so that they can make sense of this. That's for sure. At that point, you probably want to start thinking about bringing in an analytics vendor or an expert, because there you're talking about, how are you going to shape that process, and how is the IT architecture going to match that, right? And there might be a bit of a give and take on both of those. So.
Another question up at the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I believe in public data rather than big data, because 20 years I came from an telecom consultation background, providing consultation to telecom providers and around the world. And 20 years back, the United Nations met and said in a meeting that access to internet is a right of all. It's not the service. It's a right of all. That's why the United Nations is funding projects to provide broadband internet to rural areas. Same thing will happen with the data, because nowadays we're seeing the governments are meeting, say public data is the right to access by anyone want to make use of this data. So I like the initiative of Waterloo here as a government, to provide an open exchange data. But I think Kevin, you said that you only pointing to sensor, you're not storing data, you're not collecting data and providing it. So how much it take? How much is the cost of connecting two cities like Waterloo and Kitchener? It's with the PWLAN today technology, it's less than $10,000 the cost of connecting, and it's a free network. And this will boost the number of LoRaWAN devices or LPWAN devices be used. In a $2 sensor can be used, and these can be a platform, as an open platform provided by the municipality, by the city, to anyone wants to use this data. So this will be a better initiative than just pointing it to a different centers, because there are today platforms like DeWitt and others, we're doing that in a more effective way. Why why this initiative came, especially it's funded by the government.
So the reason it came about is because you're right, we don't host data, but we point to data, and part of the reason is because we don't want to do something that somebody else can do better than we can. We're very much gap fillers. But the whole reason the initiative came around is because there is a wealth of this data. It is public data. It's certainly true. But the private sector really, for the most part, has no idea how to tap into it. There's a willingness there. I think it's a challenge in translation, if you will, in terms of being able to tap into it. And to your point about open sensors and things like that, I think it's the city of Chicago that has the Array of Things project that's going on. So they're instrumenting the city with various ways to measure pollution and stuff like that. I believe they're making that open already. So again, it's driving in that direction. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it really has to be driven by purpose. because it's not inexpensive to do some of these things, and once the purpose becomes apparent, then I think all these things will fall into place.
I was part of the group which covered Amsterdam, the whole Amsterdam, cost us $5,000 only to cover the whole Amsterdam in 2 days.
Wow.
And that's really what's empowering the Internet of Things revolution is the low cost of sensors, low cost of computing, and low cost of access.
It would cost $2,000 only to cover one city like Waterloo.
Okay, so we have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. We'll wrap up with some final comments and give you some time to network and drink some beer. So, gentleman in the middle there, go ahead.
An idea we've heard reiterated a lot today was that the data can be really valuable and also probably very sensitive. And a field that seems to have been evolving as much as big data is also cybersecurity. I would like to know, how are you thinking about cybersecurity issues, especially in light of things like cybercrime, Ashley Madison, and what you're doing, sort of protecting that.
I mean, there's a whole realm of data security and privacy. It's a whole facet of data on its own. I've seen companies go to the point, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the browser DuckDuckGo. They actually don't store anything. So that's a complete kind of slap in the face to big data, really. It's you browse, I don't track anything. So you've seen that right through to people just really locking down and picking, they call it PII, the personally identifiable information, and segregating that off and keeping that very protected, and then using a key for, having a key to that exists in all the other data that exists. Cybercrime, I mean, especially around the Internet of Things. So did anybody hear about poor Barbie today? Poor Barbie. Mattel, yeah. So Hello Barbie was released in February, and poor thing got hacked about 2 days ago. So she comes complete with Wi-Fi that connects to your home internet, and hackers have figured out how to hack in and take control of her. So the idea behind it is it turns Barbie into Siri. So you say something to her, it goes back to a third party, translates it, and Barbie says it back. And so that's pretty scary, especially for those of us with little girls. So it's a serious thing, and it's something that people really have to keep on the forefront, especially if you're thinking of storing personal data within your application. You have to treat it with the proper security. The health in healthcare, you've got the FIPA standards, the Personal Health Information Privacy Act, I believe is what that is. If you're doing anything with healthcare, you have to follow that. So the legislation changes depending on where you're operating.
Security is a huge problem, without a doubt, right? Like, it has to be addressed. There are lots of organizations. There's a cyber warfare going on out there, right? There's no denying that, right? U.S. government's collecting all kinds of data. That's very apparent. They've even used data and interesting systems and the internet to, for example, to damage Iran's nuclear system. We know in China, they've got, the military has whole, armies of people hacking into companies, collecting their data, and then actually reusing that, for example. So there's been lots of, it's not proven, but lots of interesting correlations where they hack into companies and then they go and acquire those companies later on. So it's a massive problem. I think the Internet of Things makes the problem even worse in the sense that now you've got you're collecting data all over the place, right, and storing data in lots of different places, as opposed to storing it centrally. You might think storing it centrally is actually less secure, but most security breaches are not actually from within the data center. They're in less secure places. People are being stupid and allowing software viruses to run on their machines, or they're leaving their machines in places where they can get hacked. That's the most common way that data gets lost.
Well, and the Sony hack is classic for that. So they didn't hack into the source systems; they hacked into LANs that had a bunch of Excel files sitting on them with all kinds of information, which is still blows my mind how many companies are run with Excel.
A great book that I've read a while back. If you haven't read it, it's called Black Code. It might freak you out, but it's a really good book by researchers at University of Toronto, talking about all the cyber warfare that's going on and how data is getting used. It really opens your eyes.
I think we had a question over here. Yes?
Aaron, you were talking about how data could be considered like an asset, and I'm wondering if regulations could be put in place for an asset like this, and whether we could learn from, say, financial institutions that manage another asset, money. Financial institutions must adhere to very strict rules and regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and they get examined by federal regulators and such. Do you see in the future that there could be regulations in place for personal data, like a Sarbanes-Oxley Act for data?
Sure, there could. Absolutely. It's almost like we talk about the Internet of Things, we talk about the Internet. What about the Internet of me? I'm creating all this data everywhere I go. What's my right to it? When do I start to have a say in how it's being stored and what's happening to it, and can I get access to it? What are the rules around if I decide I want to share my information, and then all of a sudden I decide I don't want to do that anymore, right? Like, you see,
Is that ever possible though?
I don't know. With regulations, can it be, right? I think we're far away from something like that, but we're not that far away from people standing up and saying, no, that's me, that's mine, you're collecting this, I deserve to see it.
I think, so this is maybe a little far-fetched, but my view would be that I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 20, 30 years we see fundamental shifts in business models. The business model today is primarily based on the Industrial Revolution. You go get some raw resources, you turn it into a product, you go and sell it to someone, right? You, the person buying it, you buy it because none of that stuff there was yours. The data revolution that we're seeing is fundamentally sort of changing that, right? I'm generating the data for you. I'm doing the Google search. So my Google search is adding value to Google. Why should Google own that value? Why shouldn't I own that value?
Why am I not monetizing?
Yeah.
Right?
I go buy a book on Amazon.com. That purchase is of value to Amazon because they can go and monetize that, the insights that they gain from that. Why should Amazon be the one that owns that? And I think the Internet of Things sort of changes that even more fundamentally because it raises the fact that, all the data is generated from us already today, right? I see it set on my keyboard, all that data comes off of my keyboard and eventually flows to a data center somewhere. I think the Internet of Things is longer term, going to fundamentally change that. You can't move all the data to data centers. There's just going to be too much data generated, right? So new models have to exist where the data exists on the edge. But if the data is existing on the edge and closer to me, well, what does that mean? Then it's more obvious that that's my data. It's not why is it the company's data. So I think those are big fundamental questions that people aren't really asking, but I think they will be asking over the next couple of years as they start to think about, that's my data. Why should you own it?
Just to add to that, I'd say every time you download an app and you start it for the first time and it wants to access this, and this. First time it really became apparent to me is when I said, well, hell no, you can't have any of that. And then all of a sudden I couldn't use the app anymore, right? So clearly, there's nothing for free. Google's not for free. The apps aren't for free. They're monetizing you some way or other. And right now, what's the option is just don't use it and create something on your own. And it's really, is that an option? And I think it becomes a very personal question, whether you're willing to give up your own personal data to get the value of whatever it is that is requesting that data from you.
There have been attempts to have even decentralized Facebook systems, Facebook, but where all the information you store yourself and you share it sometimes and someone accesses it from you. And these systems just haven't worked out because just Facebook found a way to get people wanting to be part of their network, and nobody's aware even of these alternatives. And again, people don't want to not be able to use these systems or these applications that everyone else is using. So unless there's some kind of push by people to regulate who owns the data, or there might not be a push towards that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Does anyone have one? In the back.
Okay, so my issue is
people have been lying with statistics forever. It's lies, damn lies, statistics. I don't forget who said it, but anyways, I'm terrible at quoting stuff, obviously. But I don't see that ever happening. No, I mean, because how do you do that? I mean, it's been pervasive forever, and I think it's just about. That's the thing about Google is if I have a hypothesis, I will always find a study out there that supports my hypothesis. If you can milk a Jersey cow and get chocolate milk, I'll get a study out there that says that Jersey cows give chocolate milk. And so I think it's about being an informed consumer and understanding, the source of it. Because the one thing that didn't come up, I don't think it's come up tonight, it didn't come up in the film, is let's talk about the integrity of the data itself. Right? Just because the data is made available doesn't mean it's good data, right? But I'm surprised it didn't come up at all in sort of any of the conversation.
It was light in the Google search thing, right? It talked about, hey, tangentially we could figure out,
The flu
map
bug?
the flu,
Yeah.
but oh wait a minute, if something changes, then the data is actually kind of crap, right? Because if the media talks. It assumed a baseline where the media wasn't talking about it. Now the media talks about it, and the algorithm's gone up.
But I'm talking about a case where somebody's putting up intentionally fictitious data to to lead somebody astray around something like that. I mean, where does that enter in? It's not a cybersecurity issue; it's a data integrity issue. And I mean, we haven't even started to talk about that kind of stuff.
Sometimes actually it's not that people, even when they say two different studies, when they come up with two different answers, it's not that they're doing it intentionally. Sometimes it's just people misunderstand how to apply certain fundamental statistics to it, and they design their experiments in such a way that they think that it will show one thing versus someone else, a statistician, someone more informed, going over it can say, no, well, I see an imperfection here or imperfection there. I can't replicate this, and they're not really trying to misinform you, but some of them might be. But some could actually, like we've come across some studies where people are just applying or structuring their experiments in a way that they're really getting certain results, but they're not just statistically accurate results, or they can't draw the conclusion from those results that they are drawing.
Thank you. I'm going to selfishly end the session with my own question, but before I do that, I want to take the opportunity while we have everyone's attention here to thank the panelists for coming out today. So Aaron, Kevin, Robert. I also want to thank SAP for partnering with Internet of Things Waterloo to make this happen tonight, so thank you very much for making this happen. And before we close out the night with the last round of questions, one thing that I encourage this group to do is Internet of Things Waterloo is a great movement. We've been able to grow the network over the past 2 years. Your participation, your attendance is what keeps us going. I encourage you to reach out to any one of the team members, Candace, Grady, Ian, myself, Katrina, Anita, and provide feedback, because 2016 will be an exciting year for everyone. We're always interested in hearing your feedback. If you want to participate, help out, sponsor, we're always looking for sponsors. Please reach out to us and connect. So to close out the night, I'm going to ask the obligatory question that a panel always has to answer is, if we're to leave tonight, individually, what is one thing that you want each individual to walk out thinking about what we talked about tonight? So Aaron, I'll start off with you.
Data's an asset. It needs to be used, and it'll make a big difference in your world if you use it. Yeah, and it's not hard to do. It's not as scary to get started as people think it is.
For me, it's data is an enabler, and at the core of whether it be Internet of Things, open data, big data, should always focus on the individual.
For me, it's the type of imaginative things that people can come up with to do with the data. And the movie was just the start of the type of things that people have thought of to do with the data, how they can use it, how they can visualize it, what kind of algorithms they can do. And I think people should keep the imagination going, the new ideas coming out of how we can take advantage of it, how we can derive new value, how we can visualize it in a new, amazing way.
We are in the early phases of, I think, a really interesting time, right? And a really interesting revolution going on as it relates to data, which the film really talks about. And frankly, so, all of us, we're all focused in this space. We're in a very small but mighty community of Waterloo region, and I think that we can solve some really interesting, really difficult problems, but it's about coming together in a way like we are tonight, right? Engaging in dialogue, and hopefully this leads to engaging in interesting projects that take on some really interesting problems.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. So we're going to conclude this panel session today. Feel free to hang around for, 10, 20. How much longer do we have, Ian?
As long as you want to buy beer from the Apollo support, you'll be.
There you go. All right, so, and of course, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is providing an arena for you to network, so please do yourselves a favor, connect with someone that you don't know today, and have a drink. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe drive home.